Welcome to Sharks, Snakes and Shareholders, an Innovators Uncensored show where startup founders and entrepreneurs share their horror stories of shady term sheets, toxic boardrooms, and investors you wish you declined. Each week we'll have a new guest, ranging from angel investors and VCs to deal makers and founders, who will rank each of these horror stories on our investor red flag scale. Hosted by ShipShape.VC's very own Daniel Salko.
Hi, I'm Daniel Safko. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ShipShape.VC, a free-to-use investment search engine that enables founders to identify which investors they should be speaking with about the technology that they're building. We're really pleased about this show because it helps founders identify the horror stories that other founders have gone through without needing to repeat the same mistakes themselves. I'm delighted to have with us today Hattie Willis. Now, Hattie contributes to the ecosystem via two businesses. One is Guessworks and the other is If We Raise. Hattie, please could you tell us a little bit about both those businesses?
Sure. So they're both on a mission to support the next generation of entrepreneurs and specifically to try and make sure the next generation doesn't look quite as homogenous as previous generations. So one way we do that is through Guessworks. We go into schools, universities, accelerator programs, corporates who are trying to innovate, and also charities soon. And we're trying to basically teach really core entrepreneurship skills and innovation skills that can be practiced, aren't just nice theory that founders and innovators hear and then never apply to their business. And then the second company, If We Raise, is working directly with founders. And we do that in a couple of ways. But the most exciting current way is we have growth pods. So they're for 10 founders who want to build their network. These are typically underrepresented founders who don't have uncles who work in venture capital, who don't have a ton of founder friends to learn from. We put them in a group and we embed a coach who is further along the journey than them. And the idea is we've all been in those peer groups where we all get really excited, inadvertently almost run each other off a cliff because we're like, it's definitely this way. And it's the opposite way. And so the coach is there to support them along the journey and to either help them bootstrap or to fundraise, particularly with introductions into the ecosystem.
And that is why we're so excited to have you with us today, because ultimately what we're wanting to do with this podcast series is to enable founders to build up the pattern recognition of what's gone wrong elsewhere. And obviously the more dislocated you are from almost those centers and those years of experience, the more likely you are to fall into some of the traps that we'll go into in terms of founder stories. Now, for those listening who aren't aware of the format of the podcast is founders have submitted some anonymized horror stories about their interactions with investors, and those investors have either potentially not invested, they've pulled the plug at the last moment, or they potentially have invested and then it's made the life of the founder absolute hell. So we're going to go through 3 stories that have been selected for today. And after we go through stories, we'll do a bit of analysis, we'll go through it, we'll sort of see what the founders could have done differently and what lessons other founders might be able to take away so that they avoid potentially making these mistakes and what red flags there might be that they can spot. Once we go through a story, we'll go through our ranking system where you and I, hopefully, sometimes we'll agree, other times we'll potentially disagree, where we've got 4 rankings for each of the stories and the counterparty involved. You've got oddball alert. You have, if I can remember, backseat founder, which is basically where you've got an investor that potentially pretends that they're the founder. We've all seen them. And then we have boardroom vampire, so where they're going to make your life a real pain, basically make your world revolve around theirs. And finally, business butcher, where if you're accepting the terms that are on offer, it's going to kill the business. Mm-hmm. So it should be good.
I feel like we should start giving these, we should really mess it up and give these analogs, like Bear Grylls is the backseat founder for Water to Go, but we could get punchy.
Where's Alan Sugar? And we might need to invent a new category for a certain Mr. Bartlett.
He's been getting so much shade on podcasts recently. He doesn't need us adding it.
I think he deserves it.
Yeah, fair.
Okay, right. Story number 1. This founder had a business that was approached to be acquired by another business. Mm-hmm. And that acquiring business said that everything was nearly ready, but actually they're just waiting for all the funds to be held together. Some time elapses, and rather than the acquiring business buying all the business, or all of the founder's business, the acquiring company suggests actually they buy a 20% stake to start with, as they're getting all the other funds together to make the acquisition. So this was agreed, and the founders of the business essentially said, this is okay, we're not going to basically go and raise from elsewhere. So they accepted the terms that were on offer. However, the funds that were promised for that 20% purchase never showed up. And the business eventually had to be mothballed, because actually the engagement with the potential acquirer had taken up all of that business's capacity. That business was eventually, that mothballed business was acquired by another company. The founder of the original business was kept on the board, but basically wasn't kept in the loop at all on what was going on in the company. So even though the original founder was kept on the board of the company, weren't kept in the loop. And actually the business then was saddled with debt by the new management team. And eventually that business then sort of went into administration. But the original founder was then offered the chance to purchase back the business with all of the original debt involved. Company hasn't done any company filings, and they haven't engaged with any of the shareholders either.
I mean, it's a bit of a cluster mess, to put it politely, isn't it?
Were we doing bleeping on this?
I'm going to self-beep. It's a cluster mess.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So, okay, absolute horror story. And I think one of the really interesting things that I took out of this when I was reading through it was around the founder stopping like any other fundraising activity at the original point here. And like, is that something that you've seen a lot of?
I think the first thing I always want to start with is like, it's really easy to hear these stories and be like, what an idiot. Because we can see it compounding from the outside. It almost feels like, oh, the next thing's going to be worse and worse. But if you're the founder, I have deep empathy for it, because like, why are you selling the company? So a lot of founders, by the time they get to acquisition, it's either an amazing deal, which this doesn't necessarily sound like it is up front, or it's because they just want out, they're kind of done, and they're taking what they can get. And so if you're in that stage, if I'm being honest, like, I understand how you get to this point where you're so desperate, and potentially you've been trying to fundraise, you've put effort and energy into that, it's not working, is often what I see. I've seen a lot of founders recently try and get small exits because they actually can't make the business work. And so if you're in that space, I get why you kind of grab with both hands what feels like an answer to your prayers, but you're essentially putting every egg in that basket. And then if they aren't the people they say they are, or even if just, and I think this is actually a really important point, we forget that something might change in the circumstance. That doesn't mean they're a bad actor, but actually puts them in a different position. These guys sound like bad actors, but actually we just shouldn't be putting all our eggs in that one basket. You're going to get worse terms if you do, not in a position to negotiate because no one else is putting an acquisition offer on the table. And then if something like this happens and you've burnt your runway as they did, you're in really big trouble.
And obviously your bargaining position weakens even further at that point in time, where they're the only game in town, and they know that you're desperate because you're going to them, chasing them.
And I think what founders, I think one of the big trends of the last year is that founders need to be paying more attention to cockroach plans. So what are you going to do if things go wrong?
Let's break that down. What does a cockroach plan mean?
So cockroach plan comes from the idea that what is going to survive the apocalypse? A cockroach. So how do you make your business survive anything? And a big part of this is, how do you get to self-sustaining profitability sooner? Not always deeply compatible with venture capital as a model, which wants you to grow at such a trajectory that it's really hard to get to and sustain profitability early. Though we are seeing, and curious if you're seeing this as well, I'm seeing a lot more VCs focus on getting to profitability sooner than they would have before. But so for a business owner, even if you've got this exciting acquisition, don't use that as an excuse to put down growth and revenue, because those, again, might increase your terms, especially if you've got a multiple of revenue. Like, let's try and get in a better position.
Yeah.
And B, if it doesn't go to plan, if it takes longer, what are you going to do?
Yeah, and I think the whole point around strengthening your bargaining position as you're entering into any engagement, in many ways you want to create the incentive for the acquiring company to complete it as soon as possible from their perspective. So if you're improving the business's key metrics, and obviously that's really hard to do if you're engaged constantly with them and you're not focused on growing the business, you can quite easily end up in a scenario where you're weakening the potential terms that you can see.
And it sounds really obvious to us sitting in the studio, but it comes also back to the sunk cost fallacy, right? So many times when you've sunk time into something, we value it so much more highly. I've already done all of this. Was the opportunity cost of it. Therefore, it has to pay off. And we become almost more militant that that's the right path. And actually those signals of how much energy you're having to pour into it, and it's not getting easier and better, and they're not delivering what they said they're going to deliver, and you're over delivering your side. You've got to be able to pick up those warning signs, and hopefully have put yourself in a place where you have optionality so that those warning signs don't, because we're going to ignore them more if we don't have another option. Yeah. Right. We've all been in those scenarios in our private lives, in our business lives, where when the other path isn't good, you'll stay in a bad situation much longer.
I'd like to come back to the point around sort of sunk cost fallacy. Are there any good mental tricks or gamification or scenarios that founders can can basically put into their mind to sort of help them avoid that?
Something that I've thought a lot about since Jay, who's the founder of a company called Imagine Insights, said this on the podcast a long time ago. He talked about this idea of you've just got to keep your equilibrium. And that means not over celebrating the wins as much as it means not over steeping in the sad points. I find that so hard. Personally, my personality is in order to bounce back, I've got to get super excited about stuff. But actually, I do think there's a lot of wisdom in that. If you're not over attaching too early to something, and that doesn't mean as founders you don't take, oh, that's really exciting, someone wants to acquire us, and enjoy it and feel proud in that moment. But equally, and the other thing he said that I try so hard to remember in sales is it's not your money until it's in your bank account. And so until that point, and I think it would be lying if I said there's this really easy mental model to not get overexcited about the thing that you want most in that moment. I just don't think that exists. But I do think trying to come back to this idea of, okay, am I losing my equilibrium? And how hard would this be to bounce back from emotionally? And then is there something I can do to maybe run some other scenarios so it doesn't feel like this is the only option? And this I think is a big part of what lots of people with anxiety try and do. So don't go to the anxious level of you try and rehearse every possible scenario and you're wasting a ton of time on stuff that hasn't happened. But do have some backup options. What would you do if this fell through? How would you keep the company going?
And I guess I think the whole what would happen if this just didn't happen, and ignoring how much time you've put into it is great, and we definitely have learned that the hard way in a couple of occasions.
And I think you feel like you'll get that time back if it pays off, but that time is gone now. Yeah. And actually, you need to be able to I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had is that you can only make the best decision with the information you have at that given time. But we're so bad at if we've started making a decision earlier and then things lag, it takes longer, something changes, we're really bad at updating our information and changing the decision.
And I think that's one of the interesting things that I thought also came out of this was around the founders were evidently going down that route of, okay, there is this acquisition, but actually the timelines have just moved a bit out and to the right, and they've engaged in an agreement for the purchase of not all of the company, some of the company for a certain amount. And we talked a little bit about this beforehand. How restrictive could that potentially be for that company in terms of other optionality and generating that?
I think it really depends on who the acquirer is and why they want to acquire it, and whether that's going to put off potential other investors because they're going to think there's someone who has 20% of the company who has interests in a different direction to us. And future investors might not be excited by an acquisition at that level. So you've then got to be able to convince them we've taken the money and we're on the path to acquisition, but so you're not going to get a huge multiple, but still give us some money in the short term. That's going to be really hard. Yeah. So it might put off investors in the short term. Potentially it puts off a different kind of partnership or collaboration. And we talked briefly about this. It's adjacent, but I think it's important. I see a lot of founders looking at something called CVC, corporate venture capital, which is where big corporates put in an injection of cash. And often those corporates might be a customer of the startup who then becomes a strategic investor. But if you're not careful, that can really put off other customers who actually don't want to buy from a company that their competitor has invested in. So I think it depends who the acquirer is, what the risks are going to be. But also, again, does that 20% mean they're the only path forward, or does it genuinely give the optionality? And to your earlier point, I would want to be making it clear that 20%, like, they're going to get the 80% on worse terms because they're faffing. And so we're going to carry on increasing the value. We're going to use that 20% hopefully to really drive up the value. It's going to cost you a lot more.
I'd love to break that down a little bit in terms of what are some of the things that companies can do when they find themselves in an acquisition scenario to basically reduce the opportunity cost to the business, because evidently like this, from a runway potentially perspective, but also capacity of the management team, has been eating up so much time in this company that they can't do other things, to the point where the company's dying.
I think it comes back to like, why are you getting acquired, or like, why are you willing to get acquired at this stage? And so I think you'll have companies in really different positions depending on if like they're growing and doing really well, and this isn't, it's just a deal they can't refuse, versus it's a gentle way to,
Realize the gains.
Yeah. And for founders, I think what we're seeing an awful lot of, and I think there's about to be a load of shade thrown at it. And I want to be really clear on how I word this. I think what I'm seeing a lot is founders who've had businesses that have not worked. And rather than shut down the business, they're doing very small sales so that the founder can say they've had an exit, so that they can then go on and increase their chance in the future. And I think we're about to see a ton of shade thrown at that by people who've had better outcomes and who kind of see this as like cheating the system, false representation. And I think the founders who are doing it have to be very careful not to do that. But I also think we have a really bad attitude to failure in the UK. And actually, if you were in the US and you had a company that failed, it wouldn't put off future investors in the same way. And so I actually get the behavior here in a very different way. I took a detour. That wasn't what you asked.
That's absolutely fine. I love the fact that we went down that rabbit hole. And I wonder, to exactly that point around contrasting UK versus US investor approaches and the way that founders feel like they have to position themselves. I feel like, and I don't have any data to prove this, but I'd like to go get some. I think
my favorite thing when you say that, because I know I'm going to get an email in 2 weeks with the data.
Yeah, I need to do some. I need to do some surveying, but I think that US founders that didn't get an exit. So let's say they got a small exit, but they didn't return initial capital to investors. I think that a US founder would consider that a failure, but I think that actually founders in the UK are probably more likely to try and paint it as a success because it is vital for them in terms of their future ability to raise capital, because of that attitude towards failure we've got.
Yeah. I think, I'm not saying anything novel when I point to Adam Newman as an example of, very public failure with some really shady dealings, and raised more than most underrepresented founders raise in aggregate in a round for himself on his startup, having raised recently for another startup that he just quietly sunsetted. So there is this very real behavior in certain ecosystems that you can even fail really publicly, really fully, and actually you're still investable. Here, I just don't see that happening.
And I think there. I don't
think that's good, by the way. Just to be clear, I don't think we should be investing in the Adam Newmans of the world.
Yeah.
But I do think it tells the story of if you're in a certain group. And I think the failure point in the US is also different if you come from different backgrounds, different demographics. I don't think you get the same opportunities to fail. But I think it really does play a part in why founders here are so desperate to repackage. And I get that.
Yeah, me too. The incentives here are just very, very different, drive different behaviors, even if in the long run, not so 100%. Good for the ecosystem or indeed investors, ultimately, in terms of the return. I thought the last bit in here was really interesting. I think it's just foul play really around the founder being kept on the board, being kept in the dark, and then finding out the business has been racked up with loads of debt, and then being offered the opportunity to acquire the business back with all that debt. I just, yeah,
I mean, like, where's my red card? Like, that's
yeah, I think
just bad play.
we should just, I think for me, this is just definitely business butchery.
Yeah, I mean, like, literally killed it and then tried to saddle the founder personally with debt he didn't accumulate while running the business.
Yep.
Like,
Special.
they didn't get him locked up. So,
Yes,
I mean,
bravo. Thank you. If someone comes in with an acquisition being like, you're not going to prison. But that's it.
That's the line they didn't cross.
Okay, so moving on to story number 2, which is it's a fair bit shorter. So essentially, there's an angel syndicate that confirmed that they're going to invest in a founder. And then they started asking lots and lots of questions of that founder after having initially confirmed that they wanted to invest. And they then backed out of the deal entirely, accusing the founder of essentially using ChatGPT for all of their documentation.
Yeah. Just really quickly before we dive into this, if anyone listening doesn't know what an angel syndicate is, it's a group of angels investing together under a kind of thesis, right? I think sometimes founders don't know what they are. You should definitely, we're about to tell a horror story about them, but I'm a really big fan. So I do think they're a really good way to meet lots of angels at once who are aligned around the space, hopefully, that you're building in. So still go and look at them. But yeah, so to me, this makes my spidey senses tingle that they're not being honest with you about the reason. So what are they really worried about with your answers being generated by ChatGPT? Is it that they don't think they're accurate? Is it they think they're just too generic? Like, those might be signals that they think you're being lazy and you're not taking it seriously, and maybe that puts them off. But equally, if you're doing it and the outcome is good, you're just putting more time into running a business. Like, are we really at the stage where we don't think using ChatGPT for things that we get a good outcome is a good idea? Really?
Well, I think that's the really interesting thing here, I guess, about the rate of the technological progress. I don't actually know when this occurred, but if you think about how quickly that type of information, just pulling data from unstructured or even structured company data and putting it into a format that makes it easier for investors to read through what the actual state of the business is. Like, if you ignore for a moment hallucinations, assume that it gets it right, then actually that's saving everyone time in that. Like, the data, like the synopsis of what's happening in the business is more accurate. It's based upon real data. I suppose there is a danger of the human not being in the loop about all those data points. And I would be concerned about that if I were an investor.
Yes, and so I think this is the point. I think this is the point: is we don't quite know enough to know, and we can talk through the scenarios where it would be good and would be bad. I think a really easy analog that lots of founders I come across fall into the trap of is people who are like, I'm not financial, and so they outsource doing their financial model, and then investor asks about it, and they're like, oh, I can't answer that.
Yeah,
that not being able to speak to anything you've submitted, if you're not the technical founder exception, you can bring in your technical founder to talk about the tech side. But ultimately, if you're the CEO founder, you need to be able to defend the strategy behind everything. And you should be able to add a richness in how you talk about it. But that's different because here they're saying documentation. And so I guess the question is, do they really feel, my sense is, if they've confirmed they're going to invest 5 figures, that's going to have come off a pitch. They've seen the founder talk, they're impressed by the founder, which makes me just think something's come up in DD that isn't...
they've got cold feet.
Yeah, and that it's... And the thing that's come up in DD may not be something that they feel like they can stake themselves too strongly as a reason.
And why would an investor do that?
Like, so many reasons. So they might just like go off it. There might be a change in politics within the fund. So I've had slightly different with an angel syndicate, right? Because they all function slightly differently. So some of them will require a certain percentage of people to agree to invest before, like, there's a threshold you have to meet before they'll do anything. Some of them it's like everyone kind of goes in the round and puts in the same ticket. Some of them there's variance in the ticket. So I think it depends whether you're talking about an angel syndicate or a venture capital fund who have very different processes in place. Which do you want to go into?
Let's go into the angel syndicate bit.
So why would they lie about it? So maybe someone has a conflict of interest they don't want to declare. That's the shady one, right? They
see all the documentation.
Yeah. And I want to caveat this. And I think actually this is the problem with the startup world, is that we're trying so hard to get to absolutes in spaces where there aren't absolutes.
Yeah.
So two things are true. One, you can't expect investors to sign NDAs because they're seeing so many deals. And actually, the truth is your idea is probably not that novel. Like they'll almost certainly see something else similar. But there also are, I know of cases, a friend of mine who was the founder of a beauty business that did very well, got a call from a VC mate. Oh, we've seen this pitch. We really like the idea, but we don't really think the founder's very good. Do you want to do it? Like, as the founder? Like, what the hell? And then equally, you see all sorts where, I mean, there was, this is public, Hambro Perks just got fined £2 million for essentially a judge found that they had stolen IP and given it to a portfolio company from their startup. So there is a really hard balance for founders of when you try and get a confidentiality agreement with an investor. But when they're doing detailed due diligence, you should be able to get something like that in place. In the early days, no, don't ask for an NDA before you share your deck. But down the line, you should be able to get some of that stuff.
Yeah, I saw the Hambro Perks story, and I thought actually that's really interesting because every investor says no. Every investor is too busy. That they've seen too many of the same deals. They could never do it, and like you shouldn't worry about it. And I think it's really interesting to see like a concrete example right in front of us of a VC being taken to court for doing exactly what everyone's told or has been told. Like VCs will never do this to you.
But I'm going to be really controversial, and I might regret saying this. I reserve the right to change my opinion when someone argues that out of me. But it's like getting in a car. Like every time you get in a car, you know there's a risk you're going to die. And that is something that we all make our peace with every day. Because we know if we want to get to A to B, that's a choice we're making, and we want to go a fast way.
Yeah, the optimal number of like health and safety regulations, the optimal number of deaths is not 0, because if you get to 0 on health and safety regs, some people elsewhere are dying, and probably more than the number of lives you're saving.
Yeah, and it's like all of these things, right? We get scared about, the standing joke in my family is my aunt once went to get on a plane, and my grandmother said she was really worried about her getting on the plane, and my aunt said, Granny, her mum, like I'm more likely to be killed by a donkey kicking me than I am to die in a plane crash. And my granny's reply was, darling, promise me you won't go near any donkeys. But I feel like we're comfortable taking lots of risk. I think we should tell founders, like, we shouldn't lie to them and say there's no risk of that. We know cases where that's true, but they're edge cases. And they'll get, and then you have to remember, like, the things that get in the news because they're newsworthy.
Yep.
And actually, I think the vast majority of VCs don't have time to do this, don't have the inclination to do this. And so if you want to go fast, like getting in your car and you want to drive faster, and that's why you're making the car journey, then we might have to absorb some of the risk that this happens. And that doesn't mean the system's perfect and doesn't need reform. But actually, the other way doesn't really work either, where everyone's too scared to look at your idea because they're worried they're going to get sued if they then do something similar in a few years' time. That doesn't work.
I'm not saying that that this neatly goes across, because not every VC that acts in a damaging way to the value of other businesses necessarily gets taken to court. But like, if you look at the 2 million sum versus the amount that gets invested in a given year, actually it's quite a small proportion. Although that might be survivorship bias, where you basically selection bias, where because it's been taken to court, like that's where you're getting that data from. But actually, there's quite a lot. There's a lot more value destruction that happens. But
and I would say, how do I put this and not get sued? I would say that with those kind of funds in general, where something comes out about them in the news, then when you speak to people in the ecosystem, they're not surprised. Those VCs do not have a good reputation. There are horror stories before that. And so this is one of the reasons I think it's so important. And this goes back to angel syndicates, goes back to venture capitals, goes back to individual angels. I don't think founders feel empowered to do the level of due diligence their investors are doing on them back.
Yeah.
And that looks like go and speak to people that they've invested in who didn't work, not just the ones that did, and ask what were they like. Like, did they hound you for stuff? Did they make you feel awful in the process? Did they actually give practical advice? Did they feel approachable? Did they drag their heels on like just signing documents and make it a pain practically? What are they actually like on that journey? And you won't capture every case. You're probably not going to speak to the person who isn't showing anywhere in their portfolio, but try and get the best data you can out of that.
And I think, this is something which I definitely didn't do at the start and definitely started doing, I don't know, like 18, 24 months ago, where I would always go and try and find out what's the reputation of that individual like from whoever I could potentially ask. And if I got a message that was mixed enough to warrant further investigations, then I would basically go and do that. And it's great as well because you can then gather data that helps warn others off certain behaviors and potentially individuals who exhibit those.
And I think it's an important point around network, that it's so hard to quantify the value of your network, but actually building people around you who either know people who could do that sense check for you. So we often do it if we raise founders. They'll get a term sheet or they'll tell us about an investor and they'll say, does anyone know them? Can we get a sense of their reputation? And then we'll go out. Often, me and my co-founder don't know them personally or don't know their reputation, but we'll go out to our angel investors who we do back and we'll ask them, we'll put toes into other parts of the ecosystem, other communities, normally be able to get them an answer pretty quickly about whether they seem to be just like, no one knows about them, which is sometimes a bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
Sometimes just they're really early in doing what they're doing. And then also we've had along the way a ton of them where it very quickly comes back that investors see investing alongside those kind of funds as a warning sign, for instance. So it's really helpful to try and invest early in that network.
Definitely have some of those in Wales, unfortunately. And actually, it's really interesting. You see more of that in regional ecosystems where actually there's a known red flag investor that you wouldn't want to have them on the cap table because they really do limit your chances down the line.
Yeah. And I think individuals, that probably happens more in regional ecosystems, and then funds, it probably happens more in bigger ecosystems. So like there are lots of SEIS funds that founders go to that don't do great terms.
Yeah.
That investors know don't do great terms. And so they look at that on your cap table and think, oh, you were quite desperate, weren't you? And fair or not, that puts them off.
And I think worth mentioning as well, so there are interesting incentives for SEIS, EIS funds to act in a different way to the way that a non-SEIS, EIS fund would. And so part of the reason for that is SEIS, EIS funds basically operate along tax year lines. So as you're coming up to April, an EIS, SEIS fund in the UK has an incentive to make sure that they're deploying all of the capital that they've been given for investors for that particular tax year.
Yeah.
But also because of that need to deploy quickly, the way that the fund often makes money isn't necessarily from the total returns of the fund. It's from how much they're charging on each investment transaction, which can be, I've seen 15%, which is a huge tax to pay on top of.
That's obscene, actually. That's really obscene.
I think there might be,
The cost of capital of that is, and I think not enough founders are thinking about the cost of the capital. This is a side note, but equity funding feels free because you're not paying interest on it. And because if you make it, you're like, I'm going to be a millionaire, I won't care. But actually, if you make it the way you think, that money should be costing you orders of magnitude more than a loan might be. There are reasons you don't go and get a loan as a founder if you can avoid it, but yeah, they're not enough founders are actually looking at that and going, this is expensive money, this is not cheap.
Yeah, well, actually, I almost like contrarian example. I actually think if you can get debt early, do it, because actually the cost of capital from an equity perspective, if it works, is obviously much lower. Obviously, the success percentage.
Well, and the thing about debt, just to be like really upfront about with most founders, is you're not going to be able to get debt
Without personal guarantee.
Yeah. And so lots of founders, if the business doesn't work, and so it depends on the kind of business you're building at the stage. Like if actually it's like put money in, get more money out, like there's enough proven, like get debt.
Yep.
I mean, this is not financial advice, but I do think it's almost impossible to get an early stage business loan that isn't secured against you, the founder.
Yep.
And so, and particularly founders, obviously we work in a space around underrepresented founders, tend to have less safety net. So actually, in the case that things go really wrong, they can go really wrong really quickly, which is why I'm always a bit cautious about it.
Which, I definitely approach all forms of financing with great caution.
And this is not legal advice.
Okay, right. So I think we're on to story number 3.
Whoop, whoop.
And actually,
Oh,
I'm going
yeah.
to put that. Sorry, we should do the ranking for that one. I don't think there's anything. I think it's not good behavior, but I just think it kind of is part of the course. Sometimes investors say things that they don't mean, and potentially want to retract things, or they discover something that means that they've got to change their mind and not tell you the whole truth as to why.
Yeah, look, it's not good acting, but again, like we said on the first one, if you've got some optionality, you're a bit protected from this. And I think it does a huge amount of harm to founders who don't. And I feel incredibly frustrated on their behalf that this happens to them. But I don't actually even think it's that odd. Like founders withdraw stuff all the time, which again doesn't make it good, but it makes it something that you can and should be preparing for much more readily than some of these, which are like, that's out of left field. How would you even begin to anticipate that's how they're going to act?
Yeah, and I think to a point that you raised earlier around, the money isn't yours until it's in the bank, and ultimately you've got to have optionality essentially up until that point.
Yeah,
as much as possible.
And I will have founder friends listening who have been through absolute horrific cases of having investment withdrawn really last minute for really reasons that just don't add up on paper. And if they're listening, I still love you and I felt for you hugely at the time, and I don't take any of what I said back about how mad I was at the investor. I probably, when it's a friend, you're probably like, business, butcher. But in general, I think it's not as uncommon.
Yeah, Unfortunately, it's not an uncommon pattern to see.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, on to the last one. So, again, it's an acquisition, which is kind of interesting.
We've got all the acquisitions today.
Yeah, we've got a couple of them. So,
or the attempted ones.
Sorry?
Or the attempted ones.
Yeah, attempted, unfortunately, at this stage. And okay, this founder was speaking with an adjacent business, and that adjacent business was considering acquiring this founder's business, including an initial investment. And then what was really interesting here is, so the acquiring company had very high level sort of executives, had great experience in previous well-known firms, and that business then vanished and just went dark. They had been strung along for a little while, so they had regular meetings. They sort of kept on committing, like, this acquisition is going to happen. We're just signing things off internally. That happened for a while, and then that acquiring company just vanished. And if you're the founder in that scenario, like, I would be really scared. Like, have they just taken all of what we've told them about the business, and have they just basically started ghosting us, and we're left here, like, hung out to dry? But anyway, I thought one of the things that was interesting from the story was around the company that was acquiring. Actually, the founders of the acquiring company restarted, essentially phoenixed the same business in a completely different jurisdiction under a different name, which is an interesting behavior. I'm not saying that there aren't scenarios in which that wouldn't be plausible and there wouldn't be reasons, like legitimate reasons for doing it. But I think in this one, it's kind of it's a real shame for these founders, and unfortunately, these founders also had stopped fundraising because of the certainty that they had attached to this potential opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the lessons are super similar, right? You don't have the certainty that it feels like you have. And actually, I really feel for them, because it sounds like they had some reasons to be believing in these individuals, that they were, who they said they were. I mean, I would want to go in a company's house and see what happened with the old company, have a little bit of a cheeky stalk.
Actually, how would you do that? So let's say a founder hasn't done that before.
Yeah.
What do you do? So, what is company's house? What can you find on there? and how what things would you look out for on company's house that might be red flags to you now with sort of spidey senses?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, at this point, it's kind of too late for me to be using it necessarily as spidey senses. So company's house, you can get things like annual accounts, which can give you a sense of their cash position and how they're doing as a business. Are they actually making money? Are they losing money? Have they got big investments? Like, it can help you look at all those things. So company's house, if you're in the UK, just Google company's house and the name of the company, and it will normally come up. You can just do a quick check against the directors that it's the company you think it is. And then you can see all of their annual accounts that they filed. So I'd definitely be looking at those. And I have a hilarious WhatsApp group with a friend of ours in common who anytime something like this happens that we hear about, I get a little update. Like they're so good at going through Companies House and doing the detailed.
I think there might be a guest from a
I
previous
couldn't
episode.
possibly comment. And they're much better at than me. So but the signals I would look at are around like where cash is and isn't coming into the business through revenue, and also whether there's investments. Obviously you can see if they've filed bankruptcy and things like that as a company or as an individual. But I guess with this case I'd be looking at it's too late to influence it. I'd be doing that out of curiosity. Because there's a danger, depending where you are with them filing their accounts, that it might not show up in previous years of accounts if they're suddenly in a recently bad position. So you can't exclusively use that to check. I mean, you might look at it and see, hang on, it doesn't look like you were doing great this year. Convince me why you're suddenly in a place to be acquiring companies when it doesn't look like you actually had very much cash in the bank at the end of last year. Might be a signal you could look at.
Yeah, interesting. I guess that's obviously great for a founder to have that, even if it only gives a sense of the trajectory of the company.
Yeah, and is it as, and we'll all do this, right? We'll all choose the happiest statistics. And what is really hard about founder life is like things can, in the early years, like 5x in a year in terms of revenue, if you're doing really great. And so you could be like, yeah, we just had a really great year last year, but we haven't filed those accounts yet. So it's not that you want to like just disbelieve people, but yeah, maybe it gives you a bit of data to look at.
And founder optimism knows no bounds in many instances, and therefore,
I mean, like, let's be real, you can't start a business unless you have some degree of kind of messianic, I'm going to be the one to do this when no one else could. Is that messianic?
Let's go with it.
Messiah complex?
Yeah.
Are they the same thing?
Yeah,
or I just made a different word?
No, I mean, you have to be like, you have to be sort of a combination of visionary and absolutely barking mad, right?
Yeah. And like delusional is a critical founder quality, right?
Yeah.
Against all the odds, I'm going to do this. And maybe you do, maybe you don't. But then you have to be ready to translate that when you're speaking to someone else. And I think the tricky thing is founders get frustrated that investors are doing this with them. But if you're looking at being acquired by another company that isn't like a huge company where you kind of know, and even with huge companies, like a friend just had I need to not show off them by giving this identifiably, but a friend had a very big contract with a very, very large UK company, pulled the day before it was meant to be signed. I've had that happen in a previous company. You kind of think you can hide behind these like, oh, but they're this well-known brand. That doesn't mean that they won't do what they have to do until the contract is signed, until the money's in the bank. It's not yours.
Yep. I think that's a very, very sound, like sort of soundbite snippet of advice really for
Also,
for
I need
founders.
to practice that advice because I'm terrible at it. Literally every sales call, I'm like, now we are millions in revenue this month. And then like the next week, they're like, oh, sorry, we had a change.
Changed.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah. And I think it's really hard as a founder because you are pouring into this everything that you have, your sense of self, your time, your energy, everything. Of course you want to believe the good signals because how else are you going to keep yourself going?
But I think, and also on the flip side of that, to exactly that point, part of the value in the company is the upside optionality from the conversations that you've got. So like good investors won't bank every penny of your potential pipeline in terms of your valuation. But you would be doing your existing investors a disservice if you didn't include the value of the opportunities in front
100%.
of you, even though they haven't closed. Like investors will discount that sort of like, future cash position.
And it's a bit like, again, founders tie themselves in knots over their financial model and whether it's even worth doing because it's all made up, particularly in the early stages. And actually, investors are looking at that as a signal of two things. One, ambition. Like, do you actually think you can get big enough to be exciting to me? And then two, strategy. How are you planning to get there? And if I then interrogate you on it, have you thought about this at all? Have you scenario planned? Do you actually, like, what if you're wrong about this? Where's that number coming from? Like, are you completely delusional or is there is there at least something in this that you can defend?
Yeah.
Or it's going to show me how you're going to flex.
Yeah. Is there a irrational path forward?
Mm.
Okay. I think we're ready to do a rating review on this with regards to the.
I'm going to have to remember what we originally.
So we're basically business folded.
Oh yeah.
The acquiring business folded, and essentially the founders then appeared in a different market. But unfortunately, the founders who had engaged here hadn't made other plans, didn't give themselves that optionality.
It's really tricky, actually. I don't know how to score this one. I feel. Yeah, you go first.
I mean, I'm gonna go with an orange here. Like if, and actually, there's part of the justification. So recently, a friend's company had a public offer put out.
Oh, interesting.
For their company, but looking into the details of it, the market cap of the potential acquiring company wasn't sufficient to cover the value of the transaction. Which is, I mean, granted, like not all of the stock was listed necessarily listed. Yeah, this is a public offer, but yeah, like it's possible that not all of the share capital of the company was publicly listed.
Yeah, fair.
And it's just a partial listing, and the market cap, but the market cap was not sufficient to do it. It's kind of interesting. Some companies might be in situations where making the acquisition offer actually increases. Like even if you assume the capital of the acquisition, actually the total created value of those two companies does exceed like the sum of the parts, if that makes sense.
Yeah. By putting them together, suddenly you have like distribution for your existing product, and you can go like 50 times faster.
Exactly. So I'm gonna go with a sort of an orange card as it doesn't directly translate, but it's
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm picking up, I think that makes it close to the first one is like they clearly, well, depends how earned the confidence was. If the confidence is earned, it's like either orange or red, right? They were being really strung along to quite disastrous consequence, just like the first one. I think, and the fact that they were totally ghosted, as you say, would suddenly make me really worried that something really shady had gone on here.
And also, I suppose the lesson of like social proof is not a strong enough signal for confidence.
100%. But it's really hard in these settings. Like often that's all you're going to get, like to progress the situation.
Especially if the acquiring company is not from a country with more open accounts and company filings.
Yeah. Yes.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Hattie, to go through the stories. And we'd love to have you back in future.
I'll be any trip to Wales and I'm here.
Yeah. Any last words of wisdom that you'd like to give to founders?
I think one of the things I wish more founders did is to be really honest with themselves about how their personal motivation and the business motivation do and don't align at different points. And I suspect what's happened in a couple of these stories is it's not working for the founder personally anymore as a company, or the company's not working and the founder's then put in a place where they're having to make really hard decisions. And I think we just need a little bit more honesty really early from founders about what do you actually need this to achieve, on what timeframes, and if it doesn't achieve this, on what timeframes, like what options do you need to be ready to explore, and how does having investors involved change those options that you have? I would love founders to dig into that more.
It's brilliant having someone like yourself who gets sort of so up close and personal with so many businesses and sees so much of this happen to go through this, because I think you're right, but it's difficult to know without being that close to so many businesses that have gone through it. So Hattie, thank you so much.